Hello, everyone. Welcome tonight. Thank you for coming to our program on eugenics tonight. My name is Indra Mungal, and I work at the Asian Art Museum in the Education Department. Before we begin, I'd like to do two acknowledgements. One is that the Asian Art Museum wants to acknowledge that we sit on the San Francisco Peninsula and are located within the unceded territories of the Ohlone peoples, the Ramaytush and the coastal Miwok. We remember their continued connection to this region and give thanks to them as we live, work, and learn on their traditional homeland. We offer our respect to their elders and to all Indigenous peoples, past and present. Also, of great topical importance is that Asian communities in the United States and around the world continue to be targeted with hate and blamed for the outbreak and spread of COVID-19. Unfortunately, the scapegoating of minority communities in times of crisis has a long and ugly history. The Asian Art Museum condemns racism and xenophobia in all its forms. We're committed to making the museum a welcome space for all and creating programming that fights xenophobia, prejudice, and discrimination. Today, we stand with the residents of San Francisco and Oakland's Chinatowns, especially our elders who have been targeted with violence. Talking about the continuum of being targeted, tonight's program, I'd like to talk about how this came about for us. After having a conversation with tonight's moderator, Milton Reynolds, who is deeply knowledgeable about the topic of eugenics, my colleague Allison Wyckoff and I believe that the topic was very timely and critical that we present. We hear in the news about Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color's distrust of COVID vaccinations. And many of us have no historical frame of reference for the reasons. It is our hope that this program will enlighten all of us and make us all more responsible as political decisions are made in the arenas of medicine, criminal justice, and social safety nets, to name a few. So a recording of this program will be on our YouTube page in a few days. And also what will be, and I will put this in the chat, is we will be showing clips of the film tonight. And I'm just putting this in the panel, in the chat. So if you'd like to watch the whole film, it's an hour and a half, and it's really deeply compelling and important and just fascinating history. This link that I put in the chat will be live until March 25th. And after that time, if you want to watch or purchase the film, there's a link to do that. And educators, the filmmaker Stephanie Welch has generously offered to make the film free to educators to either have a free link or a DVD. So now on to introducing our wonderful panel. They are really powerhouses of information. I'm just reading an abbreviated version of their bios because we have 4 of them. So we're putting a link in the chat with a longer bios. So our moderator tonight is Milton Reynolds. He is a local career educator, author, equity and inclusion consultant, and activist. His activism has been devoted to disrupting systems of racial injustice with a focus on juvenile justice reform, law enforcement and accountability, environmental justice, youth development, educational transformation, and disability justice. He doesn't have time to sleep. Our next panelist is Obasogie K. He's a Haas Distinguished Chair and Professor of Bioethics at the UC Berkeley in the Joint Medical Program and School of Public Health, and a Senior Fellow at the Center for Genetics and Society. He has a book with another panelist tonight. He co-edited with Marcy Darnovsky, Beyond Bioethics Towards a New Biopolitics. It's an anthology that examines the past, present, and future of bioethics, and you're all going to want to read it tonight after our program. Marcy Darnovsky is the executive director for at the Center for Genetics and Society. It's a Berkeley-based public interest organization focusing on the social implications of human genetic and assisted reproductive technologies, including the legacies of eugenics that can distort their development and use. The organization, the CGS, serves as a thought leader, a key resource for a network of scientists, scholars, health professionals, and civil society leaders working for reproductive, racial, and disability justice. And our filmmaker, whom we'll start with tonight, you'll meet her first, is Stephanie Welch, a documentarian and executive director of Paragon Media, which is a nonprofit media organization that is the co-producer of the film A Dangerous Idea. She's also the senior producer at Bioneers, which we love, Bioneers, a media nonprofit, and producer of the award-winning syndicated radio program Bioneers, Revolution from the Heart of Nature. So please read more in the link about their bio, read more about them in their bios, and I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie now. Thank you.
Thank you, Indra. Thank you so much. Oh, I'm so honored to be part of this series with the museum, and very pleased with Milton Reynolds for connecting us, and so happy to have the Center for Genetics and Society, Marcy and Osagie on the panel too. I really appreciate all the support for this film over the last few years, and so many events that we've done together, and I'm really excited to be here tonight. I'm tasked with giving a little bit of background, excuse me, about eugenics historically, for people who may not have seen the film yet, and I'll touch on basically what we do cover in the film. It's such a hugely deep history, and there's so many things that I would love to talk about and contextualizing it. But one of the things that struck me when we were doing the research about this film, we first started looking into it from a medical point of view, actually, in genetics, and uncovered this history and this very disturbing legacy in the United States, especially. And one thing that stood out was that it was, there weren't that many critics of this whole world of eugenics, concept of eugenics. And the official definition, people say it means well-born. So, but the basic idea is that you are a product of your heredity, and that you are where you are because of your genes or your heredity. And so if you're at the top of the heap, as they say, or at the bottom of the heap, and all of these ways to characterize society, it's just a product of your biology. And so when we really dug into this, it was clear that this was, I think, as William Tucker says in our film, it was a supposedly scientific solution to a political problem that came around in the Gilded Age. This is about the same time that the notion of a gene came about. And it was really, as the time, I think, inequality now, social inequality, and so much of the inequalities that we see today are actually worse than they were in the Gilded Age. We weren't saying that for a while. For a while, we were saying it was the worst inequality ever. And now, sadly, we've actually exceeded the Gilded Age in this stark inequality. And so eugenics comes along as a supposedly scientific solution. And many people were, there were labor strikes, it was paralyzing industry. The conditions of life were really, really difficult. There was an influx of immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe that people were there were a lot of racism toward them. So this sort of emerged as a way to tell everybody that really the way to change society was to change the heredity of the people who were actually in the society. take control of breeding and make sure that people who had the better genes would procreate and others wouldn't. So the thing was, is that, there was no proof that there were such things as genes at the time. No one had found them. No one even really knew where to look. In fact, that's what they were tasked, geneticists were tasked to do at that time. But they went ahead along with it anyway and started making these claims. And even by 1913, the New York Times was, they were publishing headlines that social problems, that it was proven that social problems could be based in heredity. So alcoholism, poverty, all of these things were in the biology and not in the society. And so, like I said, there weren't that many critics at the time. There were some people who were saying, well, we don't quite have the science yet, but basically there was a consensus that eventually we're going to figure it out. So maybe we shouldn't necessarily apply it. But there were a lot of people who said, no, we're going to apply it anyway. And they proposed to close the borders, which was one way to stop certain people that they wanted, namely in this case, Asian people and people from Southern Eastern Europe coming in. Scientists testified and helped to pass the 1924 Immigration Act, which was the most stringent immigration act that I'm aware of that we'd passed in the country, and basically shut down the border for people coming from those areas, many who were Jewish. And then there was sterilization, which was the favored method to keep people from reproducing. And Harry Laughlin and Charles Davenport were at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. They basically were the center of this movement that grew to be international. And so these were very prominent scientists pushing this stuff. So they testified. Everybody believed that what they were saying was true. And so in 1927, the Supreme Court in the United States, with Oliver Wendell Holmes, our supposed liberal, signed on and said, yes, people could be forcibly sterilized. So that by then there were 33 states, I think, or so, that ended up having these laws that resulted in, on paper, 80,000 or so people sterilized, most likely against their will. But that was the law. And officially that law still stands. They never actually reversed that. But as Milton will talk about too, I think, it didn't end there. And most of the historians that you read will talk about it and say, well, it all wrapped up after World War II when they saw where this would go. But actually it didn't. And that we cover that in the film as well. And we'll see some clips that refer to that. And so I think one of the things that I just really wanted to stress in this discussion was, these are all unproven claims, and it's really the most prominent people are pushing that. And as we'll hear later in the discussion, we still hear these things pushed today, these beliefs, unproven beliefs about people, about what makes us who we are, however you want to put it. And I really look forward to the discussion, because I think a lot of things are coming up in the news that I get emails about and get into discussions with people about, that really it's very concerning, that the racism and the anti-poor aspect of eugenics, everything is really coming back, which is what we were worried about when we were doing the film. We were seeing, just as we were making the film, it was just increasingly becoming just a more disturbing rhetoric that we were hearing about, a lot of things that we could hear from eugenics. In fact, I'll end with this. This is my favorite quote. One of the critics that did come about was G.K. Chesterton, actually, who he's a British writer and philosopher who wrote, "Eugenics is nothing but terrorism against the poor committed by 10th rate professors. My question is, who will practice eugenics on eugenicists?" So I thought that was really one of the best statements that we came across of an actual critic from that early time, in the early part of the century. So that's just a little background, and I really look forward to the conversation. I'll sign off and let Indra take it back, and I'll be around for a Q&A later. So thank you.
We're just going to turn it right to Milton. Take it away, Milton.
Yes, thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here with you all tonight. Big thanks to the San Francisco Asian Art Museum, Center for Genetics and Society, who the two panelists are representing, as well as Stephanie Welch and the great film that she's giving us an opportunity to explore tonight. So my opportunity is just simply to set the stage. And so why this film, why now, why this conversation? So if we simply look back to this summer, we can see an unprecedented uprising of citizens who were protesting still their demands for refuge from state-sponsored violence. This time around, they were joined by thousands, if not millions of others who also shared their concerns. But looking back to the run-up to this last election, the rhetoric has been clear. Whether you're talking about these notions of making America great again, or whether you're talking about basket of deplorables, we're hearing echoes of themes that can be rooted in eugenics. And so as a society, the United States, that promulgated eugenics and played a pivotal role in the international sort of movement, we have yet to have a thorough and sustained reckoning. And I think if anybody's paying attention to the media cycle, it's clear that the inability or the unwillingness to interrogate these ideas more thoroughly in a more sustained fashion really imperil our democracy. I think it's also fair to suggest that these issues are not limited to the United States, that around the globe, we are seeing a rise of racial nationalism. We're seeing a rise of anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiment. And it's hard not to speak to the asymmetrical consequences of the COVID pandemic and to understand that the asymmetrical impacts on communities and the asymmetrical responses to the needs of communities are rooted in habits of mind that create hierarchical patterns of devaluation. So these are some of the ideas that we're going to take on tonight, and I'm super delighted to be in conversation with our panelists. Their work has been critical to my own development, and I think you're going to find that it's going to be critical to yours as well. So we'll be back shortly, and just so you know, the way we're going to rock this thing tonight is we're going to have 3 different clips, and we'll have conversations in between the clips. I will have conversations with the panelists, and then we're going to open it up for a Q&A. And at that point, Stephanie will join Marcy and Osagie, and then we'll have a great exchange, one I'm very much looking forward to. So with that, I say let's roll the clip and get this party started.
By the end of World War II, sterilization continued, but rates diminished in most states. Organizations and journals changed the word eugenics in their names to genetics to avoid association with the unpopular movement. But many prominent scientists, encouraged by the discovery of DNA, continued to believe in the gene and to advocate for eugenics, including the 2 co-discoverers themselves. In a speech to his fellow scientists, Francis Crick offered his own eugenic vision.
We have to ask, do people have a right to have children? Or to have at least as many children as they please? And it seems to me that we have to begin to consider that the answer to this question might be no, they don't have a right. But the child is handicapped. Wouldn't it be better to let that child die and have another one? And what about a child that's born incurably blind? Is there any reason nowadays for keeping such a child alive? In other words, should we not have an acceptance test for children?
James Watson also regrets that eugenics has been tainted by the Nazi legacy. He says it's our responsibility to prevent the birth of those he deems unfit, as long as families themselves make the decisions. Watson believes in the unlimited use of genetic engineering to enhance future generations, and isn't worried such eugenic measures would be taken to the extreme.
Hitler's got us twice. We're hostage to what Hitler did, and that things which we might say are sensible, we can't do because people say, well, Hitler would have done exactly the same thing.
The DNA discovery helped to obscure the country's eugenic past. But the battle continued between those who claim that inequality is natural and inevitable and those who fought to expand equal rights to everyone who'd been left out.
So will you join in the battle to give every citizen the full equality which God enjoins and the law requires, whatever his belief or race or the color of his skin?
Lyndon Johnson's Great Society represented a total rejection of the eugenic worldview. It was the most ambitious effort in the government's history to deliver on the American promise. Among the hundreds of pieces of the Johnson administration's legislation was the Immigration Reform Act, which abolished racial quotas encouraged by Harry Laughlin in the 1920s. Other laws banned discrimination against people with disabilities who had also been targets of eugenics.
So there is a kind of dominant theme that's going to take over American political intellectual life, that people can and should mobilize to change their condition.
We will walk until we're free, until we can walk through any school and take our children to any school in the United States.
Social movements mobilized under the banner of equality and created the pressure Johnson needed to push through bills that addressed racial discrimination.
Not only did the Great Society defeat centuries-long belief in biological genetic determinism of poverty and inequality, it said that those could be conquered through social programs, and then it did that.
Johnson was a New Deal Democrat. He intended to use his presidency to go further than Franklin Roosevelt and to reach millions who still languished in poverty. He reminded Americans that genetics was not the root of the problem.
Poverty is not a trait of character. It is created anew in each generation, but not by heredity, by circumstances. Today, millions of American families are caught in circumstances beyond their control.
People are interested in being treated as human beings. They're interested in having other people treat them, as the Declaration of Independence says, as equals. That's the first thing that's needed in the war against poverty.
There was no better person to represent the view that biology was not destiny than Sergeant Shriver. As director of OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, he knew he could pass concrete legislation that would tackle poverty head-on. With Johnson's help, Shriver convinced Congress to approve $700 million to launch a remarkable set of programs.
This is Dick Van Dyke here to tell you about an army America is using in its all-out war against poverty.
Thousands of Americans seeking equality of opportunity enlisted in programs such as Volunteers in Service to America, Job Corps, Upward Bound, Teacher Corps, and Youth Corps. Shriver also created the Legal Services Program to provide lawyers to people who couldn't afford representation. Thousands of communities were now able to sue cities for discrimination, to fight evictions, and to hold landlords accountable for housing violations. In an effort to advance equality of condition, communities in remote areas were given access to health care for the first time, as well as grants for adult literacy programs and to improve infrastructure.
I think people have the wrong ideas about the poverty program, that it's sort of a handout. You're going around giving money to people, and it's, as soon as the money's spent, it's not going to do any good. What I've seen today indicates that what you're doing is training people, and you're giving people an opportunity to do for themselves, and it takes the action of government.
One of Shriver's most successful programs was Head Start, which provided early education, nutrition, and medical services to compensate for the lack of opportunities that held poor children back. Head Start programs allowed millions of children to thrive. The success of these programs disrupted power relations across the country, prompting city and state officials to pressure Shriver to cut off funding. Shriver didn't back down.
For the first time in the history of this country, poor people actually have a place
and a way in which to express themselves. We're creating life at the community level. When you got life, you got movement, you got dissension, you got action. That's what we want.
By 1970, War on Poverty and other Great Society programs led to the fastest and sharpest decrease in poverty in the country's history, over 40%.
And that goes completely against genetic theory. No one was changing genes at this time. This was done through social programs. And that's when we begin to see this very strong counter-revolution begin to take shape.
By 1969, new leadership at the White House radically shifted the direction of the country away from Johnson's egalitarian vision of a great society. Secret tapes recorded in the Oval Office revealed Nixon's racist view that certain groups of people were less evolved than others. Pseudo-scientific papers came out at the time that bolstered Nixon's prejudices and revived eugenic claims about IQ.
And it was the center of the counter-attack, the resistance to widening equality and widening equality of opportunity.
15% of the blacks are above the average white. 85% are below.
And the argument was programs like Head Start were essentially not workable because the difference between inner city black kids' IQs and white Caucasian IQs was genetic, and that because of genetic determinism, there's nothing you can do in the environment and the educational process that will really make up for that difference.
Like eugenicists before him, Jensen believed Black people should limit their birth rate in order to phase out bad intelligence genes. And he felt the policies allowing them to receive welfare benefits only exacerbated the problem. Nixon was also disturbed by continuing the current policies.
First, we cannot delay longer in accomplishing a total reform of our welfare system.
We're going to put more legal badges on welfare rules at $2,400 a family. I have great expectations for it, but I don't think it's going to make it for 500 years.
As Daniel Moynihan put it, at the time that the Nixon budget was being planned, the winds of Jensenism were gusting through the White House with gale force. How convenient for the Nixon budget that just at the time that he wanted to cut back on programs, it could cite the scientists' findings as a rational justification for what is truly based on different motives.
All right. So that was our first clip. I'd like to invite Marcy and Osagie to unmute themselves and turn on their cameras. And let's get our conversation started. So as you both know, we jump into the film a little bit later in the flow. So there's a lot of history that precedes, Watson and Crick, dropping the DNA conversation in 1953. So I'd love if you could both take a moment or two to just catch us up. So from your perspective or your understanding, what is eugenics and why is it really important to understand to pick up this conversation that we're just starting right now? Marcy, you want to jump in first?
Okay, sure.
So you can both,
yeah, no, actually, I think let me start by echoing and adding to some of the points that Stephanie made about eugenics in the teens, 20s, 30s, before World War II, when it was a widely popular movement across the political spectrum. So progressives, conservatives, people believed and put into practice eugenic beliefs in the forced sterilizations, but also in what's sometimes called positive eugenics, counseling people on how they should choose their marriage partners in order to have better children, and having better babies contests and fitter families contests at state fairs. And so at that point, it wasn't something to be, it wasn't a matter of dog whistles and subtle hints. It was a very proud movement. This was the way we were going to better society, by weeding out those people who were biologically inferior and encouraging the reproduction of people who were biologically superior. And it was funded generously by philanthropists, some of whose names we are familiar with today. And it was promoted enthusiastically by many scientists and others who we remember, some of whom we remember as fondly as progressive heroes, but had this really unfortunate side. So I think it's important to say that because after World War II, as the film starts out by saying, things shifted and the eugenics justification for inequality was often a little more subtle than it was in that pre-war period. And the clips that we saw, as you said, it picks up where most people's understanding of eugenics leaves off, with the Nazis and the genocides that they committed. And so what I think this film and this clip especially is inviting us to do is to look at American political history for the last 50, 60 years and see what it looks like if you look at it with eugenics at its center.
Great. Would you like to elaborate on that, Osagie?
Sure. I think the only thing I would add is that I think it's worth thinking about and appreciating the remarkable contributions to eugenics made by American scientists. So we tend to have this idea that eugenics was a predominantly Nazi phenomenon happening in the 1930s, 1940s. And I think we really need to appreciate the extent to which Nazi politicians, scientists, and researchers look towards the United States in terms of both the scientific research and the political arrangements to understand how to implement eugenic ideologies in their own country. And so there's remarkable amounts of evidence from, Edwin Black has done some great work in this area. James Whitman has done some great work in this area in terms of documenting the kind of transatlantic conversations and admirations between Nazi politicians and researchers and American scientists. And so once we understand that context, we start to have a better appreciation of the deep roots of eugenics within the American political and social fabric. And that allows us to understand and also have an appreciation for how eugenics continued to linger after World War II. So, another assumption that we often have is that, well, after World War II, we understood how eugenics was a bad idea and it kind of gets faded away. And that's also not true. And the film does a good job of documenting how eugenics kind of reformulated itself in a manner that became deeply entwined with many aspects of contemporary social and political life.
Thank you both. I mean, I oftentimes think about the intellectual inertia of eugenics. Mm-hmm. And so if we go back, that, by the 50s, it had been rolling for several decades. And so it didn't need to be promulgated so intentionally because many people had accepted those ideas as gospel truth. And I think that it is one of the places where bipartisanship has remained consistent. So that's an interesting and challenging thing. Mm-hmm. So picking up with the clip on Watson and Crick, we oftentimes see sort of the emergence of this understanding of the gene as that posited as a partition between new science and good science versus eugenics, which was the old pseudoscience. And we hear both Watson and Crick articulating sets of notions that are deeply essentialist and also communicate in very profound ways the notions of hierarchical valuation. So maybe one of you could speak to that, and if we've got time, we'll get the other one in. But our next clip is shorter, so we're going to have an opportunity to sort of delve deeper into the conversation. So just know we'll pick this back up if we don't get a chance to wrap a nice bow on it in this exchange. Why don't you go, Osagie, since Marcy started the first one, and then we'll just sort of alternate back and forth. Maybe we'll just do it like that.
Sure. So, I think it's important to always be skeptical of these hard distinctions we make between old and new, and understanding that what we're dealing with here is a continuity of thought that, we can date back at least to the 18th, 19th century with scientific racism evolving into forms of eugenics that developed and emerged throughout the 20th century that then shifted after World War II into new forms of thinking about biological essentialism that come to justify existing social hierarchies. So I think it's always important to think less in terms of discrete periods of time and more about continuities of thoughts and how legacies and traditions and ways of thinking shape the way that society finds ways to justify the status quo.
No, I appreciate the warning against sort of periodizing ideas as though they don't have a life of their own. Mm-hmm. So I think we've got just a little bit of time. Marcy, you want to weigh in on the?
Well, I think one important point is that even though now people often will actually define eugenics as a pseudoscience, at the time, it was the cutting edge science. And I think one thing to appreciate is that even though it was the cutting edge science of its time, by our standards, its tools were very blunt and crude. So, you know, from when Mendel was crossbreeding his peas, or even when Watson and Crick were deducing the double helix structure of the DNA. At this point now, we have the ability to actually modify the DNA of living beings, and it puts us into a very dangerous territory that I hope we'll come back to and talk about a little more, because unfortunately the ideas that the shocking ideas that Crick and Watson were shown espousing were not, they were not one-offs, and those ideas were not one-offs that they held, and then they were not the only scientists that held them. And Watson in particular maintained a very strong hold on many younger junior scientists for a couple generations, actually. And it was only after he repeatedly said the most offensive things about, you know, why shouldn't all girls be born pretty? I think it would be great if there were no ugly girls. And, you know, we know we're gonna, it's okay to discriminate against fat people. And then about race, just shocking things. We know that I feel gloomy about the intelligence of Africans. After years of these kind of statements, finally, he was kicked out of his honorary positions at the Cold Spring Laboratory. But it took repeated offenses like that.
Great. So that's a great place where we can wrap up this first exchange. So we'll all camera down and mute ourselves, and let's roll the second clip, and then we'll jump back in. I also want to note that already in the chat, people are asking us to think about CRISPR and some of the more recent technologies. So we'll definitely cover that. Look forward to.
After the Relf case, there were few open calls for sterilization or other extreme eugenic proposals, and the fight for equality continued.
That we were fighting for our dignity. We were empowering the least educated among us, the poorest among us.
500 to 600 people in wheelchairs with walking canes and hearing aids to stop discrimination against them.
At the same time that rights have expanded for some people over the last 40 years, we've also seen increasing inequality for others, as well as the reemergence of eugenic ideas that were prominent in the first Gilded Age.
You have a kind of prevailing belief amongst the ruling elite in social Darwinism. And it's a closet, it's kind of coming through the back door. Very few people are prepared to actually come out with it and say, you know, I think women are born different from men. I think the poor are born inferior. But that actually is what they believe. If you talk to them, they don't really believe in the redemptive power of society to change the conditions of people to create much more equality.
We've also seen a resurgence of the laissez-faire ideology that dominated the early years of industrial capitalism.
Their view is, harking back to survival of the fittest, the market should determine whether or not people, for example, survive. The government should play no role. And so the last 30 years have been saturated with the idea that the social change we saw in the 60s and the 70s, that was a blip on the screen, unfortunate. What's really important, everybody for themselves.
Ronald Reagan finished the job that Nixon started. As someone who had opposed every major piece of civil rights legislation and Great Society programs, Reagan rolled back major gains made by social movements. And like Nixon, he used language coded with racial and class prejudices that appealed to many white voters.
Reagan has the image of social welfare as being undeserved. There's the undeserving poor. There are people on welfare who are driving Cadillacs, and that's one of the mantras he's using.
This strategy was described by Reagan's aide and campaign political director, Lee Atwater.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you keep saying it because that hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of it is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
I raised some of the questions discussed by the scholarly work of Charles Murray in The Public Interest. At the time, this wasn't exactly fashionable, but since then, things have been changing.
The Reagan administration found a convenient justification for cutting social programs in social scientist Charles Murray's early writings.
It called for scrapping the entire federal welfare and income support structure, Medicaid, food stamps, unemployment, workers' compensation, subsidized housing, the whole thing.
The whole thing. And such a step would leave working-age person with no recourse whatsoever, except the job market, family members, friends, and public and private locally funded services.
The implication was, why should we provide welfare and other public benefits to these people? We don't want them to take over our society. The society, in order to be fit, needs to have, in fact, again, not stated explicitly, but this was the implicit message, fewer of them.
We see lowering taxes on the rich. We see a shredding of the safety net. We see an attack on unions. We see a million kids taken off school lunches. We see 1 million elderly people and disabled knocked off Medicaid. We see 500,000 people taken off welfare. So this was an enormous change in American policy from the Great Society.
Well, let me say, I read Charles Murray's latest article on this, and I think he did the country a great service. I mean, he and I often have disagreed, but I think his analysis is essentially right. Now, whether his prescription is right, I question. Let me say why. There is no question that we need to that if we reduced aid to families with dependent children, it would be some incentive for people not to have dependent children out of wedlock. I think we ought to ask ourselves whether it is right. Is it morally right? If it is right, we ought to do it.
Ultimately, Bill Clinton worked with Congress to propose legislation with draconian cuts to social programs. Many Democrats spoke out against the bill.
America is not about bashing children because they're born out of wedlock. It is not about bashing women as illicit and unfit mothers.
Just how many millions of infants will be put to the sword is not yet clear. Those involved will take this disgrace to their graves.
The final welfare reform law that Congress approved not only ended federal aid to families with dependent children, it also deprived hundreds of thousands of documented immigrants access to basic government aid like disability and slashed child nutrition programs. Analysts predicted the bill would push more than 1 million children into poverty. President Clinton signed it anyway. 20 years later, studies show the welfare legislation actually led to more than 3 million children living on less than $2 a day.
There is no more food at this time. You can come back next Monday at 2 o'clock. That's it, Mommy. That's it. No, sir, I'm sorry. No more.
All right, I'd like to invite Marcy and Osagie back. So that's a pretty chilling clip, and I'm struck by Troy Duster's words and how prophetic they are in this moment, thinking about Texas, but COVID and so many other things. So picking up where we left off, and I guess I'll start with you this time again, Marcy. So you know, eugenics is an important history to understand, and I think we're beginning to get some sense of that now. But again, most people don't have a purchase on the history. So can you help stitch together some connections between the kinds of ideas that we heard Watson and Crick trafficking in, and how those ideas are used to inform social policies, right? And if I could sort of step back and add for a second, we've all used the word essentialist quite a bit. And so I just want to sort of suggest to people in the audience, if that doesn't make sense to you. So when we're talking about essentialism, it's basically the idea that biology is destiny, or in a more contemporary sense, culture is destiny, because culture does some of the same heavy lifting that race or biology does. So I just wanted to sort of frame that out. But you know, bringing it back to you, Marcy, how do we understand the relationship between the ideas that were being promulgated by Watson and Crick and how they inform the policies that are creating some of these challenges that we are being socialized to see as rooted in biology, right?
Well, it's really interesting that as we, there are many advances in our knowledge of genes and our knowledge of biology. And yet there are very divergent interpretations by different scientists and others about what this enriched knowledge means. So that while some geneticists are very clear that in the hierarchies that produce racism, many scientists are clear that there's no biological category of race. There's more genetic diversity in a small part of Africa than in, it just doesn't map. Genetic difference does not map onto the social and political groups that we call race. So at the same time as some people are pointing these things out, other geneticists and biologists and scientists are talking about what is written in our genes. And you keep thinking that, you know, it's old fashioned, it's been debunked and people keep debunking it, but it keeps popping back up. So today I came across a new post on the preprint server called medRxiv. So this is a scientific paper that will be now reviewed, peer reviewed, and be published in a journal. And the title of it is Using DNA to Predict Behavior Problems from Preschool to Adulthood. So here we are again, behavior problems. We're talking about genes for behavioral problems, for criminality. You know, this is really debunked science, but it doesn't mean it's not still powerful. And we hear this kind of thing over and over again. For a while on the blog post of the Center for Genetics and Society, we had a feature that we called Gene of the Week. And we would talk about the paper that had been published that week with a gene for laziness, a gene for political affiliation, a gene for educational attainment. And it's gotten to be so bad in some quarters that, for example, you can now go to a company that will, if you want to have a child and you're doing it through the fertility procedure called in vitro fertilization, you can have your embryos created, and this company is offering to analyze your embryos and tell you which ones are below par in terms of predicted educational attainment. That exists now on the market. You can go do that today.
So what we're understanding now, just through this relatively short conversation, is that there are strong intersections between the past and the present, and certainly the future as well. And I know that this falls into the sweet spot of your work at Center for Genetics and Society. I know that you're pro-science, but you're also pro-ethical use of science. And so maybe to you, Osagie, when we start to try to disentangle ourselves from eugenics, how do we understand how do we navigate the tension between what we might categorize probably overly simplistically as good science, or more ethical science is probably a better way to say it, and science that leads us down that dangerous path back into eugenics and biological determinism?
Yeah, so it's a tough call, and I think part of it is trying to well, I'll take a step backwards. So when I talk about this with my students, one thing I try to emphasize is that when we try to understand how and why certain scientific ideas become popular, it's often not simply because of its own merits. It's often because they occur at a particular social and political moment that they are useful. And so this is to say that we have to understand both the initial popularity of eugenics as well as its resurgence in the post-war era as both being responsive to economic needs. That is, the needs of the dominant class to justify grave inequality by blaming individual people as inherently inferior and justifying the status quo. And once we understand that, we start to understand the kind of long-term role that science and medicine have played in justifying social, economic, and political conditions. That is to say that we've all been taught that science and medicine technology are these neutral, apolitical ways of understanding truths in the world. And that's simply not an accurate assessment of how these fields operate. Now, this isn't to say that there haven't been miraculous developments and innovations coming out of science, medicine, technology, and engineering. Of course there have. We're having a conference on Zoom right now, right? So we can all appreciate those contributions. However, once we have a longer and deeper understanding of how these STEM fields operated, they often have served important ideological and political roles that cut across hundreds of years. And so that's where it becomes difficult to kind of disentangle the good science from the bad science, because science has, in a sense, has had this long-term relationship with markets and have been market-facing. And that has led to good innovations like Zoom. Then that market-facing has also led to troublesome innovations, such as notions of kind of biological essentialism that we've been talking about. So, so as we think about reorienting these kind of the role of science and technology in society, we have to think about market conditions and what does it mean for society to value things other than the free market, and to make sure that science, technology, and medicine are in conversation with these other values, not simply what is economically easiest or best to do.
Now, I appreciate you sort of squaring up the market and talking about market influences, because I think that, you know, if we go back into the history of eugenics, there were ideas that they posited and hoped for, but now we have technologies emerging that allow us to do some of the things that were only dreams of eugenicists in the past. In the past, I know I've been in conversations with both of you about sometimes how the hyping of technologies is market testing or market creating. But if we look at the huge economic drivers that are pushing some of the technologies, what are some of your hopes for good outcomes, and what are some of your concerns about potentially problematic outcomes at this particular moment? Since we're talking about, you know, this is a moment that's pregnant with possibility, but it's also one that's fairly tenuous and challenging as well.
Sure. So, you know, we're at a moment where notions of racial superiority and inferiority are at an inflection point. That is to say, we're starting to have, you know, renewed conversations about which groups are deserving of resources and benefits and which groups should be excluded. So one would think that we would have been done with these conversations for decades, but yet they keep on reemerging because of the social and political context we find ourselves in. And so in that context, you know, science and medicine will have some say with regards to how we think about these things. And we see this as part in terms of how the COVID conversation has interacted with these kind of current discussions around how we should order our democracy, where it's not unrelated that we're having a conversation about the rise of hateful and extremist groups occurring at the very same moment that we're having conversations about pandemics being linked to certain racial minority groups and being in a sense created by some of the behaviors of certain racial minorities. So this is to say that these things are always connected, they're always in conversation with one another, and we have to understand that these things emerge and rise because of these kind of shared contexts that allow kind of these market sensibilities to play themselves out in ways that recreate notions of racial superiority and racial inferiority. And so we have to be mindful of that. And I think what it means to engage in science and medicine in ethical ways is to always be aware of that, to be vigilant about that, and to not let one's knowledge and skills in a particular field to be weaponized to further what can be hurtful political discourses.
Great, thank you, Osagie. Marcy, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. Two different points. One is that since we're watching this film, that these clips are focusing on the political history of the United States, I think it's important to point out, and I think maybe it comes up in the next clip a little bit, is that the former president actually made many statements about how important genes are. And he had this racehorse theory of history that you had to breed better humans, and that, of course, his genes and his children's genes were superior. So we are in a place where eugenics sometimes is not subtle at all right now. And that's one place. And the other place is with this huge controversy over using powerful new gene editing technologies like CRISPR, which one of the audience members asked about in the chat, to actually control the genes and the traits of future children and future generations. And of course, people have said, you know, we can't do that, it's eugenics. And so as a result, eugenics is part of the conversation and the controversy about designer babies or heritable genome editing. It goes by different names depending on the audience. And typically when that objection is raised, it's just dismissed. And the dismissal takes the form of, well, you know, it's not going to be this, the state's not going to be telling us what to do, so it's not eugenics if it's not enforced by the state. But I think it's important, bringing it back to the question of the market, to understand that even if operationalized through individual choices, these choices are constrained by the prejudices and the problems of the society and the hierarchy and stratification of the society that we live in, and the accumulation of these individual choices spurred by marketing could well result in a very ugly resurgence of eugenics, a world of genetic haves and have-nots, or supposed haves and have-nots, even if there was no biological reality behind it.
Yeah, so we're definitely going to pick up on this after the next clip, but one of the things I'd certainly like to illuminate is that these notions around human improvement are also predicated on, in many cases, uncritical notions of deficiency and decrepitude, which too oftentimes are borne by members of the disability community and other marginalized communities who are seen as irredeemably unfit. And so we're definitely going to pick that up. And I know that those are some questions that are likely to start to populate the Q&A. So I'm going to ask us to mic down and camera down, and let's roll that last clip. But I also want to encourage audience members to start posting a few questions in the chat, and we'll get to them after our next exchange. See you shortly.
And if you tell the truth about it, it's a complex set of problems. You need a complex set of solutions that will include inevitably government. If you don't like government, you can't even tell the truth about the problem. You make up the reason. The reason is you just got some people are just born dumb. Well, that's a good, simple reason, and then you got a good, simple solution. Don't do anything, but you get a terrible outcome. And that's the great danger of this social Darwinist fantasy taking over bigger and bigger parts of the American imagination.
Continuing cuts in critical social services are resulting in millions of premature deaths, especially for people of color. Poor children in this country are now twice as likely to die in their first year of life than if they were born wealthy, often because they're malnourished and their parents can't afford the critical health care they need during that first year. People are dying from poverty and inequality at similar rates as other leading causes of death, demonstrating that the United States has been implementing on a large scale what would otherwise be considered a eugenic program. And there are troubling signs that other cruel
Stephanie, the sound is out. We may need to start again.
So I do have to be unmuted. I'm sorry. Okay, let me start again, folks.
And if you tell the truth about it, it's a complex set of problems. You need a complex set of solutions that will include inevitably government. If you don't like government, you can't even tell the truth about the problem. You make up the reason. The reason is you just got some people are just born dumb. Well, that's a good, simple reason, and then you got a good, simple solution. Don't do anything, but you get a terrible outcome. And that's the great danger of this social Darwinist fantasy taking over bigger and bigger parts of the American imagination.
Continuing cuts in critical social services are resulting in millions of premature deaths, especially for people of color. Poor children in this country are now twice as likely to die in their first year of life than if they were born wealthy, often because they're malnourished and their parents can't afford the critical health care they need during that first year. People are dying from poverty and inequality at similar rates as other leading causes of death, demonstrating that the United States has been implementing on a large scale what would otherwise be considered a eugenic program. And there are troubling signs that other cruel eugenic policies of the past are re-emerging.
We face a choice that will echo through history. In 1924, a racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic Congress passed legislation slamming the door shut on Jewish and Italian and Greek and Eastern European immigrants. We must not do so again. To stop thousands of desperate people who are fleeing unspeakable violence is unconscionable. We might as well take down the Statue of Liberty.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
You cannot rebuild your civilization with somebody else's babies. We've essentially phased out the promotion of assimilation, and we promoted instead multiculturalism and diversity as if it were our strength.
We have to be willing to say to all those who are non-European, we wish you well, but this territory is for us.
So you want me to leave?
Under certain circumstances, yes, we would ask you to go. Unless whites are prepared to exclude people, then they will be shoved aside. That is the fate which I will fight until my last breath.
It's when people get a chance to see the actual outcome of these ideas, they are repulsed. Not just Americans, people all around the world. It is not who humans are. It's not who we are. We're not a sink or swim country. We're a better country than that.
All right, so that was our last clip. So we've got about another, I don't know, we've got another 7 or 8 minutes before we open it up to Q&A. So that last clip brings us up to the present, right? And we see that these ideas are still with us in very real ways. I'm wondering about both of your thoughts in terms of moving forward. What are some ideas in terms of how we might confront these notions, these eugenic impulses, knowing that they're likely to be with us for some time and they may become increasingly consequential? What are some things that you are either involved in yourselves or that you see others involved in that you think offer some promise? Osagie, you want to kick us off this time?
Sure. So the first step is gatherings like such as this. We have to talk about it. This is a history that we simply do not teach our children. It's a history that people can be educated through high school, college, and sometimes graduate school and never really have an adequate opportunity to explore. So the first step is just to have an open and honest conversation about what this legacy is and how it's affecting contemporary conversations across STEM fields and beyond. And that can be the predicate for a conversation about what we can do about it as a society going forward.
Great. How about for you, Marcy?
Yeah, I think what Osagie said is so important. We really have to understand this history in a nuanced way in order to recognize its legacies and its manifestations today. And fortunately, there are people that are doing that. And so we see around the country and around the world, actually, efforts to rename buildings that honor eugenicists, to take down statues that honor eugenicists, and to mount educational efforts to explain what that was about, why that's offensive. And another thing I would mention is that I think that we have to look to our social justice advocacy organizations to really bring this conversation into the public sphere. So disability rights folks have been at the forefront of that effort for many, many years, in large part because they've been the targets of eugenicist thought. And so I think that their sensitivity to the eugenic implications of some of the policies that we've seen during the COVID crisis, it was really important. It was really shameful that those policies were put in place where there was going to be triage against people getting treated for COVID because they had a disability. But it was really good to see that disability rights advocates were on it right away. And I think we need to really, take their wisdom, take disability rights and justice folks' wisdom about this, and also bring it into other fields of social justice advocacy. So racial justice, the implications are so clear and obvious and consequential, and also reproductive rights and justice, and environmental rights and justice, that all these organizations have their own histories in which eugenics figured in one way or another that needs to be brought out into the light and examined.
Yeah, I see your last suggestion also sort of echoed in a question from Ken Hartunian. In your opinions, what would be an optimal coalition of organizations and what strategy could they employ to bring the evil of eugenics into light? So we see, again, sort of these ideas of how do we sort of work together to slay the dragon, so to speak. The other thing I'd like to do is just to highlight some efforts that are underway. I know that there's been a sustained effort, most recently iterated, I believe it was AB 3052, which was put together by a coalition of folks. I know that Center for Genetics and Society is one of the groups involved, I believe, but also California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. I know Alexandra Ministern and her crew, they're interested in passing some legislation which would not only pay reparations to the victims of the survivors of California sterilization, but also would, at this point in the bill, seek to mark some of the sites of transgression of the state hospitals, which would be, I think, interesting and fascinating as a way of shining light on this problematic and malignant, I would say history, but I can't say history because it's still very much with us. So before we pivot into the panel and invite Stephanie in a couple minutes, I'm wondering any last thoughts sort of about the last clip that you would like to offer up before we immerse ourselves in the Q&A more thoroughly.
Just that, I think that those clips of our contemporary emanations from the white supremacists that we see gaining so much attention and unfortunate influence right now really should be a very loud warning bell that we have to take this seriously.
How about for you, Osagie?
Yeah, before 2016, as a race scholar and someone interested in these topics, I spent a lot of my time trying to implore people to take this stuff seriously and to tell people that this is a problem and that this is going to affect our lives going forward. And after 2016, I find myself spending a lot of time trying to answer people's questions. How did this happen? And so this is to say that, we're in a moment now where people, I think, are listening in ways that they haven't listened before. And we need to use this opportunity to keep channels of communication open, to try to leverage people's curiosity about how we have, arrived at the moment that we're in, and to use this as an opportunity to start new forms of education, connecting with people, and new forms of helping people, meeting them where they are and helping them get to where they need to be in terms of understanding how these kind of past transgressions are shaping contemporary political moments. And I think through those type of conversations and curiosity about the what's going on now, we can hopefully get some movement so people understand precisely what needs to be done to help our country heal.
So thank you both, I mean, for this lovely exchange. I'm going to invite Stephanie back into the conversation, and let's just sort of roll into the Q&A. So I've seen a few juicy nuggets in the lineup there, but there's one I feel like it's really begging to be attended to. So it's an interesting question from Trip to Life Fantastic, who's asking the question, most white supremacists are white people. Is that genetically determined? And so one thing is, I'm just going to sort of assert myself into this. I know it's probably a tongue-in-cheek joke, but part of the challenge around dealing with race is that we think about race as being rooted in the body rather than in the nation. And so one of the things that eugenics has helped me to do is understand that if the nation is conceived of as a biological or a racial community, then the story of race, or the narrative, which is what it is used to normalize people's hierarchical positions. And because membership in this society has always been tied to whiteness as early as 1790 with the Naturalization Act, the first naturalization legislation passed, that creates a materiality, a material possession in whiteness. And if one can enter whiteness, to use Cheryl Harris's language, whiteness is property. And so the preoccupation with whiteness and white supremacy is about maintaining a sense of primacy. So it's not a genetic manifestation, but rather a performative one. So we'll leave it at that. So somebody, Fred Harder from the audience is asking, I believe there was a conference in New York about 1920, it was actually 1921. They did a lot to advance eugenics in the United States. Does this film cover the Second International Eugenics Congress? So I think that one's directed at Stephanie specifically.
Yeah, no, we don't cover that conference specifically. There were a lot of conferences that, you know, internationally, and that one that took place that, you know, very prestigious scientists visited and everything, but we didn't cover it, just that one specifically, no.
But interestingly, that Congress is in 1921, as Milton said, that took place at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, is being commemorated this coming fall by a group of folks organizing that are transnational, actually, UK, US, and other European and other countries. And the effort is going to be to really examine that history of eugenics in the United States, which this, as the questioner says, was a very important landmark event in popularizing the eugenics movement. And the American Museum of Natural History is cooperating with this effort and is behind it. So that's also a hopeful sign of the times.
Yeah, there have been some shifts recently that I do think give us an opportunity to be excited about some of the possibilities. So I'm going to scroll back up to a question that was offered up at around 7:09 by Joe Whitehouse. I hope you'll engage with the ethical issues associated with CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology, for which Doudna and Charpentier were co-recipients of the 2020 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. So I'm wondering, would one of you be willing to speak to that? And I know that certainly in the case of Doudna, her understandings in which he's articulated has evolved over the time. So where are we now in this conversation, and what are your thoughts about that?
Should I jump in on that one?
Yeah, or I defer to you at CGS, but one of you.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that I spent a lot of stomach lining on, worrying about over many years now. So this idea that we're going to directly control the genes and the traits that we pass down to future generations has really gotten a renaissance in the last 5 years or so because of the development of this tool called CRISPR, which, as the questioner says, is a gene editing tool, CRISPR-Cas9, and for which Jennifer Doudna at UC Berkeley and Emmanuel Charpentier, a scientist who's now at the Max Planck Institute, received the Nobel Prize just this past fall. And it is an amazing tool. It's more accurate, it's cheaper and easier to use than previous generations of genetic modification techniques, but it's not all that accurate. And so there were headlines in recent months about attempts to use CRISPR to change the genes of human embryos, and the headline used the term chromosomal mayhem. So that's the first thing to say, is that it's not really safe. And another thing to say is that although this technology is often presented as a way to prevent the births of children with very devastating genetic diseases, first of all, you don't need to be mucking around with the genes of your future children if you think that that is an acceptable thing to do. And in some cases, I do believe that, children with Tay-Sachs, if we can select embryos or test carriers, that's a defensible thing. But the conversation very quickly slides into preventing all sorts of conditions that people live with quite well. And the phrase disease and disability conflated together with no distinctions and no interrogations, you can find it in almost every report of which there have been many now, about how we should think about how we should develop, how we might regulate, or mostly it's not, the argument is let's not regulate the use of CRISPR in human reproduction. So I think we are near a tipping point in the decision about what policies will be set to regulate the use of gene editing in creating new children and future generations. And I think we have to be very cognizant of its eugenic implications and really take that seriously and not just glibly dismiss it, as so often happens in these conversations, and to really be cognizant of the fact that this is not a decision that scientists should make on their own. This is a decision that really affects all of us. And we have to take seriously that we need meaningfully broad public participation and empowerment in this conversation, because you can really imagine it altering the society that we live in.
Yeah, so I see a comment from Joe Whitehouse to the panelists, and I think it'll be one that you probably want to chew on a little bit. It says, you need to acknowledge that this technology can cure genetic diseases like hemophilia and sickle cell. There is a clear distinction in modifying somatic cells rather than embryonic cells. Yeah. So, well, why don't you step into that and help tease that out? Because I don't want to create the impression, and I know that you certainly aren't anti-science, but again, we're asking for more of a critical and ethical sort of engagement with it. So how do we help people hold that tension?
Yeah, I think I'm very glad that the questioner pointed that out. And I think that is a very bright and clear distinction. And I'm sorry I didn't make it. I typically do when I talk about CRISPR, that to use CRISPR to help existing patients by changing genes in their bodies, that's a very different category of use than the use to control the genes of future generations. So, it's not like there's no ethical questions about so-called somatic uses treating patients, like who's going to be able to afford these very expensive treatments. I think that's a really, really important one, because they right now have $1 million figures. But I think it is a different category of application than the application that we call CRISPR baby technology or designer baby technology or heritable genome editing, that I think in many countries have already passed laws that say it should be kept off limits.
Okay.
Yeah, so, and just to add, just one quick thing too, is that I mean, I know that I hear stories about gene therapy advances with gene therapy and cures, quote unquote, but I haven't seen the evidence that these, I mean, there's a certain amount of therapy. So because it's not somatic cells, I mean, it's basically a therapy, what it's called gene therapy, where you have to, administer this therapy over and over again during the lifetime, which is, that's like any medicine. But for the hype that we've heard about gene therapy and these different technologies for 40 something years now, they're really coming up short. And I think part of it is as we talk about in the film, is the complexity of human biology and heredity and the lack of understanding. So as we're talking about messing with genes, every time, especially when it comes to complex traits, these the scientists will say, oh, well, now there's no specific gene, there's actually 50 or 75 of them now, and they're all in these pathways, and there's all these ways that we're trying to figure out how they connect and result in these traits or affect these traits and yada yada. So I found that the language around it starts to get so muddied, and that it just demonstrates and reflects the real lack of understanding about how our biology works when it comes to heredity, or and especially when it comes to things like intelligence, or some of the things that they'll talk about with super babies and the fear around them. But not that they wouldn't try, and not that they wouldn't claim that they have that kind of, we're going to remove the crime gene or something and put those therapies. I wouldn't put it past them, at all. So that's really scary part for me.
So there's an interesting question that showed up in the Q&A rather than in the chat. And so I figured it comes from Kevin Keating, who was asking, has anyone collected the records and names of all those who have been sterilized by the state against their will? Or were they destroyed to avoid liability? And so I'll allow one of you to respond to that, because I know that you have some understanding of that.
I think Marcy, you probably have done.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, historians have been working very hard to resurrect that information. And one of them is someone that you mentioned, Milton, Alexandra Minastern, who's at the University of Michigan and is also a CGS fellow. She's a CGS advisory board member. She literally wrote the book about eugenic sterilization and eugenics in California and on the West Coast. It's called Eugenic Nation, and it's really worth a read. And she actually did acquire from a dusty archive the names of all the people in California who were involuntarily sterilized in state institutions, so by state decree. And she and her colleagues at the University of Michigan have set up something called the Eugenics Sterilization, the Sterilization and Justice Laboratory, I think it's called, Eugenics Sterilization and Justice Laboratory, where they have digitized all these records, and they've looked for patterns, and they can demonstrate how the targets of these forcible sterilizations changed over the years, starting out with people who were said to have various disabilities, to be feeble-minded, et cetera. Over the years, it came to be that these sterilizations were targeted more at people with Spanish surnames. And this is such important work. And it's been going on in other states as well. So Professor Stern and her colleagues have collected information about 3 other states, I think it is, in the Midwest. Disability rights advocates in North Carolina have been responsible for a reparations bill that was passed there some years ago. Virginia had similar efforts. There are similar efforts in Canada. So a lot is being done. But in our state, just to follow up on the bill that Milton mentioned before, we have not successfully gotten that bill through the California legislature to give token reparations payments to the several hundred people who are thought to still be alive, who were sterilized under state eugenic laws. But we're going to try again. It's California Latinos for Reproductive Justice and Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, and the California Women's Prisoners Group. I don't think that I have the name right, but they're taking the lead on that effort.
Yeah, and
I've dropped the link to in the chat. Yeah.
Oh, and just to remind, or to add on that we have Belly of the Beast that's just come out, Erica Cohn's film, and it's just such a just such an important film. If people haven't seen it, I know it was re-airing on PBS recently, Belly of the Beast. And, you know, I was looking back at our numbers of how we calculated when we talked in the film, we talk about the sterilizations that happened during the Nixon years and after, so like a 6-year period. And the district judge in the Ralph case looked back at his statement, and he said that there were up to between 100 and 250,000 people, mostly women, who were sterilized each year during these 4 to 6 years. And so up to 1 million people were sterilized under these federal clinics, and it just wasn't clear how many of them had actually had full informed consent to go forward with the operation. And then he said an indefinite number had been sterilized against their will, in terms of because they had under threat of losing their federal benefits. And so, you know, when we talk about like who, you know, what the records are and who submitted to it voluntarily and who didn't and all of that, I found it very difficult. And I'm so glad that a lot of this work's being done to be able to really understand that. And so many people who have, of course, will be forgotten, who suffered through this without any acknowledgement.
And certainly more work will need to be done. And I think I would like to invite audience members and others to become more informed about this history so more work can be done. There was a question, I responded to a question, but somebody was asking about K-12 education. So I did post that there is a resource, one I used to spend a lot of time teaching, called Race and Membership in American History, the Eugenics Movement, which is actually set up for teaching at middle school and high school. Please reach out if you can't find it, and I'll find a way to get you connected. So with that, I just want to thank, you know, all of our panelists for a lovely and engaging exchange. I wish we had a little bit more time. And what I'm going to do now is to thank you explicitly and hand it back over to Indra to bring us to a close. So thank you all for making the time to be here with us tonight. And it's been a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
My goodness, thank you all so much for your expertise. This is a whole new world for me, and I want to really say thank you on behalf from the attendees from the Asian Art Museum and myself. Thank you all so much. Please, folks, check out the entire film. We're going to put a survey link in the chat box, but I'm going to email it to folks as well after. Love your feedback. It really helps us as we're producing programs to know what you like to see. And thank you all. And Milton, thank you for helping us frame the conversation tonight and for moderating. Stephanie, Marcy, and Osagie, and my team at the museum, thank you all so much. And everyone, travel safely from your living room to your bedrooms or your kitchen. Good night.